Hey guys, tonight we're settling in for a journey through one of the strangest and most disturbing practices in early American history. So go ahead and get comfortable, dim those lights, maybe grab a warm drink, because we're about to spend the next hour and a half exploring the absolutely bizarre world of wife selling in America and England. Yes, you heard that right. Wife selling. As in men literally taking their wives to public markets and auctioning them off to the highest bidder like livestock. Before we dive in, if you enjoy drifting off to the sound of historical dysfunction presented in a calm, soothing voice, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel, and you'll get more content like this to fall asleep to. Now, when most people think about marriage in early America, they picture stern Puritans or frontier families, or maybe some romanticized notion of colonial courtship. What they don't picture is men leading their wives through town squares with ropes around their necks, announcing to gathered crowds that this woman is now available for purchase to anyone willing to pay. But that happened. Not frequently and not legally, but it happened enough that we have documented cases, newspaper reports, and historical records of this absolutely unhinged practice. Wife selling wasn't an American invention. Like so many of our questionable traditions, we imported it from England, where it had been going on since at least the 17th century and continued well into the 19th. The practice emerged from a very specific set of circumstances. Marriage was essentially permanent, divorce was almost impossible to obtain for ordinary people, and there was no legal framework for simply ending a marriage that wasn't working. So people improvised, and what they improvised was this deeply weird ritual that combined elements of public theater, quasi-legal procedure, and livestock auction. Let's start by understanding why wife selling existed in the first place, because the context matters for understanding how people could possibly think this was a reasonable solution to marital problems. In England and early America, marriage was governed by both civil law and church law, and both made dissolving a marriage extraordinarily difficult. The Catholic Church, and later the Anglican Church, considered marriage a sacrament that created an indissoluble bond. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder, and all that. For wealthy people, there were ways around this. If you were aristocratic or very rich, you could potentially get an annulment by claiming the marriage had never been valid in the first place. Maybe there was some technicality about consanguinity, or the marriage hadn't been consummated, or one party had been coerced. These annulments required extensive legal proceedings, testimony from multiple witnesses, often bribes to church officials, and could take years. Or, if you were really wealthy and well-connected, you could get a private act of parliament to dissolve your marriage, which was essentially divorce but required literally getting a law passed by the national legislature specifically for your situation. Obviously, this wasn't an option for ordinary people. If you were a farmer or a laborer or a shopkeeper, you didn't have the money for expensive legal proceedings or the connections to get Parliament to care about your marital problems. You were stuck. If your marriage was miserable, if you and your spouse hated each other, if one of you had fallen in love with someone else, too bad. You'd made your vows and you were bound to them until death. Except people aren't good at accepting situations they find intolerable, so they found workarounds. Sometimes couples just separated informally, living apart and essentially treating the marriage as over even though it legally continued. Sometimes one spouse would abandon the other, just disappearing and starting a new life somewhere else. And sometimes they engaged in this bizarre practice of wife selling, which existed in this weird quasi-legal liminal space where everyone involved pretended it was a legitimate transaction even though it absolutely wasn't. The typical wife selling followed a specific pattern, almost like a ritual. The husband would lead his wife to a public place, a market square, a fairground, a tavern, somewhere with witnesses. Often, though not always, she would have a rope or halter around her neck, being led like an animal to market. This was symbolic, making explicit the comparison to livestock sales. The husband would then announce to the assembled crowd that his wife was for sale, often reading out a kind of bill of sale that listed her qualities and sometimes her faults. These announcements could be almost comically detailed. A husband might praise his wife's cooking abilities, her skills at needlework, her strength for farm labor, or he might list her failings. She's quarrelsome. She drinks too much. She's lazy. She has a terrible temper. The whole thing was public theater, with the wife standing there while her husband essentially gave a sales pitch about her to potential buyers. Then came the auction. Men in the crowd could bid on the woman, and the highest bidder would pay the agreed-upon price to the husband. Prices varied wildly. Some women were sold for a few shillings, some for a few pounds. There are records of women being sold for as little as a penny, and at least one case of a woman being sold for a glass of gin. The transaction would be completed, money would change hands, and the buyer would lead the woman away, now theoretically his wife. Now, here's the thing, none of this was legal. Wife selling had no basis in English common law or American law. Courts didn't recognize these transactions as valid. The woman's legal status as the first husband's wife didn't actually change, but the people participating in these sales often believed, or pretended to believe, that the transaction was legitimate. The public nature of it, the presence of witnesses, the exchange of money, the quasi-legal language used, all of this created a sense that this was a real and binding transaction. And in practice, communities often treated these sales as if they were valid. If a man sold his wife and she went off with the buyer, neighbors would generally accept this new arrangement. The couple would live together as husband and wife. If they had children, those children would be accepted as legitimate. The original husband wouldn't try to reclaim his wife or demand she return. It was a fiction, but it was a fiction that everyone agreed to maintain. Let's talk about what this meant for the women involved, because that's the really dark part of this story. These women were being treated as property, publicly, explicitly, with their agency and humanity completely denied. They were led through streets with ropes around their necks. They were described and evaluated like farm animals. They were sold to whoever bid highest, with no legal requirement that they consent to any of this. Now, here's where it gets complicated, because some historians argue that many wife sales were actually consensual arrangements between all three parties involved. The theory goes that the husband, wife, and buyer had already agreed beforehand that the sale would take place, often because the wife wanted to leave her husband and had already chosen a new partner. The public sale was just theater, a way of creating a socially acceptable narrative for what was essentially the wife leaving one man for another. There's evidence to support this interpretation. Many wife sales involved the woman going off with a man she was already involved with. The prices were often nominal, a shilling, a few pence, suggesting this wasn't really about the money. Some accounts describe women going willingly, even eagerly, with their purchasers. In these cases, the wife sale might have been the least bad option available to a woman who wanted out of her marriage, a way of ending one relationship and starting another in a society that provided no legal mechanism for doing so. But that's the most charitable interpretation, and it definitely wasn't true in all cases. There are accounts of women weeping during their sales, of women being sold to strangers, of women protesting and being forced into the transaction anyway, of women being sold by drunken husbands who regretted it later. The lack of legal protections meant that women were completely vulnerable to their husbands' decisions. If a husband wanted to sell his wife and could find a buyer, there wasn't much she could do to stop it. And even in cases where the sale was consensual in the sense that the wife agreed to it, we have to question how much real choice she had. If your options are stay in a miserable marriage forever, or be publicly auctioned off like livestock but at least get to leave, are either of those actually good options? The wife sale might have been preferable to the alternative, but that doesn't make it okay. It just means the alternatives were even worse. Let's look at some specific documented cases to make this more concrete, because the details really bring home how bizarre and troubling this practice was. In 1732, in a case that was reported in British newspapers, a man named Samuel Whitehouse led his wife to Smithfield Market in London with a halter around her neck. He sold her for 1 guinea to a man named Thomas Griffiths. The newspaper report treated this as an amusing curiosity, describing it in the same light, gossipy tone they'd use for any market day entertainment. Part 2. Notable sales and the theater of the transaction. In another case from England in 1733, a man sold his wife at Uppingham Market for 11 shillings. The report notes that the woman seemed perfectly content with the arrangement and went off cheerfully with her purchaser. Whether she was actually content or just making the best of a bad situation, we'll never know. But the newspaper found the whole thing amusing enough to report on, treating it like any other market transaction. Pigs sold for this much, a cow for that much. Oh, and also someone's wife went for 11 shillings. There's a case from 1768 where a carpenter named John Osborne sold his wife in London for 6 guineas. The buyer was a man she'd already been having an affair with, so this was clearly a prearranged situation. The sale allowed all 3 parties to save face. The husband got paid for letting his wife go, the wife got to be with the man she preferred, and the buyer got the woman he wanted. Everyone could pretend this was a legitimate transaction rather than an adultery situation that was being resolved through this bizarre public ritual. One particularly sad case comes from 1797, when a woman named Mary Briddock was sold by her husband at Smithfield Market for 1 shilling. The report notes that she had 5 children, and her husband kept 4 of them but let the 5th go with her and her purchaser. Just imagine being that woman. Separated from 4 of your children, led through a market with a rope around your neck, sold for barely enough money to buy a loaf of bread, all while crowds of people watched like this was entertainment. And this practice made its way to America, though it seems to have been less common here than in England, probably because American divorce laws were slightly more lenient in some states, and the frontier mentality made people more likely to just informally separate or run off rather than go through elaborate public rituals. But there are documented cases of wife selling in the American colonies and later in the United States. In 1750 in New England, there's a record of a man selling his wife at public auction. The details are sparse, but the fact that it was recorded in colonial documents shows that authorities were aware of the practice even if they didn't know quite what to do about it. In Pennsylvania in 1766, a man advertised in a newspaper that he would be selling his wife at a public venue, as if this were a normal announcement like advertising a farm sale or an estate auction. One American case from 1815 in New York involved a man who put his wife up for sale at a tavern. According to the newspaper report, she was purchased by another man for $12, which was apparently considered a good price. The report mentioned that the woman was well satisfied with the bargain. Though again, we have to question whether satisfaction was genuine or just the best face she could put on being publicly auctioned off. There's another case from Massachusetts in the early 1800s where a man tried to sell his wife but found no buyers willing to pay his asking price. So he lowered the price repeatedly until finally someone agreed to take her for almost nothing. The humiliation of being considered not worth much even as property must have been devastating for that woman. She wasn't just being sold. She was being marked down like damaged goods at a clearance sale. What's striking about these newspaper reports is the tone. They're almost always lighthearted, treating wife sales as amusing curiosities or entertainment. There's rarely any moral condemnation, rarely any sympathy for the women involved. It's all very, "Can you believe this happened? How funny." Moving on to other news. The casual acceptance of women being literally sold in public markets tells you everything about how women's humanity was regarded in this period. Now let's talk about the legal status of all this, because it's fascinating how the law tried to grapple with a practice that was clearly happening but had no legal basis whatsoever. Occasionally, authorities would prosecute men for selling their wives, usually charging them with something like leading a woman through the streets in an indecent manner or creating a public disturbance, rather than anything specifically about the sale itself, since there was no law against selling your wife. Not because it was permitted, but because it was so obviously not permitted that no one had bothered to pass a law explicitly forbidding it. In 1815, an English court heard a case involving a man who had sold his wife. The judge took the opportunity to clarify that wife selling had absolutely no legal validity whatsoever. The woman was still legally married to her original husband regardless of any sale. Any children she had with her purchaser would be legally illegitimate. The transaction was completely void. But despite this clear legal pronouncement, wife selling continued, because people either didn't know about the ruling, didn't care, or figured that what the law said didn't matter as long as their community accepted the arrangement. There were also occasional cases where women who had been sold tried to get legal help. In 1798, a woman who had been sold by her husband sued her purchaser for maintenance, arguing that since he'd bought her, he was responsible for supporting her. The court ruled against her, saying that the sale was invalid and therefore created no legal obligations on anyone's part. She was legally still married to her first husband, who was legally still responsible for her support, but he'd washed his hands of her through this illegal sale, and the buyer didn't want her anymore, so she was just stuck with no support from anyone. This is one of the ways wife selling could leave women in absolutely terrible situations. At least in a legal marriage, even a bad one, the husband had legal obligations to provide support. But a woman who'd been sold existed in this liminal legal space where she was still married to one man who didn't want her and living with another man who had no legal obligations to her. If the second relationship fell apart, she had no legal recourse. She couldn't claim maintenance from her legal husband who'd sold her, and she couldn't claim it from her purchaser because the transaction was invalid. And if a sold wife wanted to marry someone else after her purchaser died or abandoned her, she couldn't, because she was still legally married to her original husband. There are cases of women who went through multiple sales over their lifetimes, changing partners through this quasi-legal mechanism because they had no other options. They existed outside the normal legal structure of marriage, in relationships that had no legal standing but were treated as marriages by their communities. Let's talk about the symbolism of the halter or rope that was often used in these sales, because it's deeply significant. Leading a woman with a rope around her neck explicitly equated her with livestock. Horses, cattle, pigs, these were the animals led to market with ropes. By putting a rope on a woman and leading her to public sale, the husband was making a very clear statement about her status as property. Some historians argue that the rope was actually a symbolic transfer of authority, that it represented the bonds of marriage being transferred from one man to another. The husband would hand the end of the rope to the purchaser, physically transferring control. This interpretation makes the whole thing slightly less dehumanizing. It's still terrible, but at least it's symbolic rather than literal. But other accounts make clear that the dehumanization was very much the point. Men would joke about their wives like they would about livestock, making comments about breeding potential or work capacity. The whole ritual reinforced women's subordinate status, reminded everyone watching that women were property to be bought and sold, that men had authority over women's bodies and lives. Not all wife sales involved the rope or halter. Some were conducted more like regular auctions, with the wife simply standing on a platform or in front of the assembled crowd while her husband conducted the sale. But the ones that involved the rope were memorable enough that they became the iconic image of wife selling, the detail that appeared in most newspaper accounts and later in historical references. There's a famous novel by Thomas Hardy called The Mayor of Casterbridge, published in 1886, that opens with a wife sale scene. The protagonist, while drunk at a fair, auctions off his wife and infant daughter to a sailor for 5 guineas. This incident haunts him for the rest of his life and drives the entire plot of the novel. Hardy based this scene on real historical wife sales he'd read about, and the novel helped cement wife selling in the popular imagination as this dramatic, tragic practice. But Hardy's fictional version is much more dramatic than most real cases. In the novel, it's an impulsive drunken decision that the protagonist immediately regrets. In reality, most wife sales seem to have been more calculated, often prearranged, less about momentary drunken impulses and more about finding a way out of untenable situations. That doesn't make them less disturbing, but it does make them less romantically tragic and more grimly practical. Now let's think about the economics of wife selling, because the prices involved are revealing. As mentioned, prices ranged from a penny to several guineas, with most sales in the range of a few shillings to a pound or two. To put this in context, a laborer in the 18th century might earn about 10 shillings a week. So a wife sold for a shilling was worth about a day's wages. A wife sold for a guinea, 21 shillings, was worth about 2 weeks' wages for a laborer. These aren't huge sums of money. Men weren't getting rich off selling their wives. The money was more symbolic than anything, a token payment that allowed the transaction to feel like a real sale. In some cases, the price was deliberately nominal, a penny, a farthing, even a glass of beer, suggesting that the economic aspect was entirely secondary to the social and emotional goals of ending one relationship and beginning another. The women's experience and regional variations. But what's also interesting is that some sales commanded genuinely substantial prices. There are records of wives being sold for 5 or 10 guineas, which was real money. In these cases, you have to wonder, was the wife particularly desirable in some way, young, attractive, skilled, healthy? Was the buyer particularly eager to get her? Was the husband trying to extract maximum value from a transaction he'd already decided to make? The variation in prices suggests that multiple factors were at work, and that in at least some cases, men really were treating their wives as valuable commodities. There's also the question of what happened to the money. Did husbands pocket it and spend it on drink, as popular accounts often suggest? Did they use it to settle debts? Did they give any of it to the wife they were selling? We rarely have details about this, but it seems likely that in most cases the husband kept the money, treating it as compensation for giving up his property rights in his wife. Just absolutely grim when you think about it that way. Let's talk about regional variations, because wife selling wasn't uniformly distributed across England or America. It seems to have been most common in rural areas and small towns, places where everyone knew everyone else and where informal social arrangements could function because the community would enforce them. In big cities, where people were more anonymous and mobile, wife selling was less practical because there was no guarantee that anyone would respect the transaction. The practice also seems to have been more common among the working classes and the poor. Wealthy people didn't need to sell their wives. They had access to legal mechanisms for ending marriages, or they could simply separate and live apart while maintaining appearances. It was people with no money, no legal options, and no social status who resorted to this bizarre public ritual. In America, wife selling seems to have been most common in the colonial period and early republic, declining through the 19th century as divorce laws became gradually more accessible. Different states had different attitudes toward divorce. Some states made it relatively easy to obtain a divorce for causes like adultery or abandonment, while others maintained much stricter standards. In states where divorce was more accessible, there was less need for informal mechanisms like wife selling. The frontier also provided alternatives. If your marriage wasn't working, you could just move west, start over, claim your spouse had died or you'd never been married in the first place. The lack of record keeping and the transient nature of frontier populations made it relatively easy to reinvent yourself. Wife selling required a stable community with witnesses and social enforcement. On the frontier, you could just skip all that and start a new life. There are some accounts of wife selling in the American South, particularly in rural areas. One case from Virginia in the 1820s involved a man who sold his wife at a courthouse sale, as if she were property being sold to settle a debt. Another case from Kentucky involved a wife sale at a county fair, conducted exactly like a livestock auction with the wife standing on a platform while men bid on her. But these cases seem to have been rare in America compared to England, where the practice persisted well into the Victorian era. The last documented wife sale in England took place in 1913, which is absolutely wild when you think about it. This was happening in living memory of people who died in the 1980s and 90s, the early 20th century, not some distant medieval past. That 1913 case is worth detailing. A man in a small English town announced he was selling his wife, and a crowd gathered to watch. A local man bid £1 for her, the sale was completed, and the woman went off with her purchaser. Local newspapers reported on it as a curious anachronism, something that used to happen but surely wouldn't in modern times, and yet it had just happened. Authorities considered prosecuting the husband but ultimately didn't, probably because they weren't sure what to charge him with and the whole thing was too embarrassing for everyone involved. Now let's talk about the emotional and psychological experience of being sold, because beyond the legal and economic aspects, we have to consider what this did to the women who went through it. Even if a woman wanted to leave her husband and had chosen her purchaser herself, being led through a public market like livestock, being talked about and evaluated, being handed over in exchange for money, this had to be traumatic and humiliating. The few first-person accounts we have from women who were sold suggest a range of experiences. Some women seem to have embraced their new situations and were happy to be free of bad marriages. Some women were clearly traumatized and humiliated. Some women accepted it as the least bad option available to them. The emotional impact probably depended on the circumstances, whether the sale was consensual, whether the woman was going to someone she loved or to a stranger, whether her community supported her or shunned her. And there was definitely social stigma attached to being a sold wife. Even though communities often accepted these arrangements in practice, there was still gossip, still judgment, still whispers about a woman who'd been sold like cattle. Children born to a woman and her purchaser might face questions about their legitimacy. The woman herself might be treated as less respectable, as having been publicly marked as someone's property. Some women refused to cooperate with attempted sales. There are accounts of women physically resisting, pulling away from the rope, running off before the sale could be completed. Some women appealed to local authorities for protection. Some women simply stood there and wept, making clear to everyone watching that this was not their choice, that they were victims rather than willing participants. But resistance was difficult because women had few legal rights and little social power. If a husband was determined to sell his wife and could find a buyer, and their community wasn't willing to intervene, there wasn't much the woman could do. She couldn't appeal to the law because wife selling wasn't legal, but that also meant there were no legal protections for her. She existed in a gap in the legal system, vulnerable to whatever her husband and community decided to do with her. Let's think about the role of community in all this, because wife sales only worked if the community agreed to recognize them. The crowd gathered to witness the sale served as informal enforcers of the transaction. Their presence legitimized the sale, made it public and official, created social pressure for everyone involved to honor the arrangement. If a community refused to recognize a wife sale, if neighbors continued to treat the woman as married to her original husband, if the local church or legal authorities intervened, the sale couldn't function. The buyer would have purchased a woman who legally remained married to someone else, with no social acceptance of his claim on her. So the community's complicity was essential. And most communities did comply, at least in the rural working class areas where wife selling was most common. This tells us something about how these communities viewed marriage, women, and property. They were willing to treat women as transferable property, to accept informal extra-legal arrangements, to prioritize social stability and men's satisfaction over women's rights or legal propriety. But not all communities were equally accepting. In more urban areas, in more educated or religious communities, in places with stronger legal institutions, wife selling met with more resistance and disapproval. There are accounts of attempted sales being broken up by authorities, of crowds refusing to participate, of buyers who initially agreed to the sale changing their minds when they saw the reality of the situation. The newspapers that reported on wife sales had mixed reactions. Some treated it as entertainment, reporting the details with amusement and no moral commentary. Others expressed disapproval, calling the practice barbaric and shameful. By the Victorian era, wife selling was increasingly seen as a relic of a less civilized past, something that modern enlightened people shouldn't be engaging in. But it still happened, which shows the gap between elite attitudes and working class practices. There were also religious objections to wife selling. Churches taught that marriage was sacred and indissoluble, and that any attempt to end a marriage through means other than death was sinful. Wife selling was both a mockery of the marriage sacrament and a violation of women's dignity as human beings created in God's image. Ministers would preach against the practice, though apparently with limited effect on people who felt they had no other options. Let's talk about the few cases where wives sold their husbands, because yes, this occasionally happened. The reversal of the usual pattern made these cases particularly notable, and newspaper reports treated them as especially amusing oddities. In 1790, a woman in England sold her husband at market for 11 pence and a pack of playing cards. The report describes the husband as going willingly with his purchaser, a woman who apparently wanted a husband and was willing to pay for this one. These reverse sales were extremely rare, probably because women generally didn't have the money to purchase husbands, didn't have the social authority to conduct public sales, and would have faced much harsher social consequences for treating their husbands as property. But the fact that they happened at all shows that some people were willing to experiment with the practice regardless of gender. There's also at least one account of a mutual sale, where a husband and wife simultaneously sold each other to new partners at the same market. This seems to have been a prearranged swap, with two couples essentially trading partners through the fiction of these sales. It's almost like early modern spouse swapping, but with the commercial transaction giving it a veneer of legitimacy. These variations on the standard wife sale format show that people were creative in using this mechanism to address various relationship problems. The public sale structure was adaptable enough to cover different situations. Husbands who wanted to be rid of wives, wives who wanted to leave husbands, couples who wanted to swap partners, people who wanted out of marriages for any number of reasons. The decline of the practice and its cultural legacy. Now let's talk about why wife selling eventually declined and disappeared, because understanding the end of the practice tells us something about social changes in the 19th and 20th centuries. The main factor was the gradual expansion of divorce laws. As divorce became more accessible, less expensive, and less socially stigmatized, there was less need for informal extralegal mechanisms like wife selling. In England, the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 established civil divorce courts and made divorce theoretically available to ordinary people, not just the wealthy who could afford private acts of parliament. The law was still restrictive by modern standards. Men could divorce wives for adultery, but women had to prove adultery plus another offense like cruelty or desertion, but it was progress. For the first time, working-class people had a legal pathway to end marriages, even if it remained difficult and expensive. In America, divorce laws varied by state but generally became more liberal through the 19th century. Some states allowed divorce for causes like adultery, desertion, cruelty, or habitual drunkenness. Western states and territories were often more liberal than Eastern states, partly because frontier societies were more pragmatic about failed marriages and partly because more liberal divorce laws attracted settlers. As divorce became available, wife selling started to seem increasingly barbaric and unnecessary. Why go through this humiliating public ritual when you could get a legal divorce? The answer, of course, was that divorce still cost money and required legal proceedings that many people couldn't navigate or afford. But as literacy increased, as legal aid became more available, as courts became more accessible, the barriers to divorce decreased. Another factor in the decline of wife selling was increased literacy and education. As working-class people gained more education, they became more aware of their legal rights and less likely to accept extralegal arrangements. A literate woman who understood that wife sales had no legal validity was less likely to accept being sold. An educated man was more likely to understand that he couldn't actually legally dispose of his wife through public sale. Urbanization also played a role. As populations shifted from rural areas to cities, the tight-knit communities that had enforced wife sales disappeared. In a city, you couldn't rely on your neighbors to recognize and enforce an informal arrangement. You needed legal documentation, legal recognition. The anonymity and mobility of urban life made informal social arrangements less functional. And there were changing attitudes about women's status and rights. The 19th century saw the rise of women's rights movements, campaigns for women's suffrage, increasing recognition that women were human beings deserving of legal protections and basic dignity. In this changing cultural context, the idea of selling a woman like livestock became increasingly unacceptable, seen as a relic of barbaric times that enlightened modern society should leave behind. But these changes happened slowly and unevenly. Some communities clung to old practices long after they'd been abandoned elsewhere. That 1913 wife sale in England happened decades after divorce had become legally available, showing that cultural change lags behind legal change. Some people either didn't know they had legal options, or preferred the familiar ritual of wife selling, or couldn't afford legal proceedings even when they were theoretically available. There's also the question of how many wife sales went unreported and undocumented. We know about the cases that made it into newspapers or court records or personal diaries, but there were probably many more cases that happened in isolated rural areas with no witnesses who wrote anything down. The historical record is necessarily incomplete, showing us only the most visible instances of what may have been a more widespread practice. Let's think about what wife selling tells us about marriage, gender, and power in early modern society. The practice reveals how thoroughly women were treated as property, how completely their autonomy and humanity were denied by legal and social structures. A woman could be sold like a cow or a horse, led through public spaces with a rope around her neck, handed over to a stranger or near stranger, all without her legal consent mattering in any way. It also reveals the limitations of marriage law in this period. Marriage was supposed to be permanent and sacred, but the reality was that many marriages failed and people needed ways to end them. The law provided no mechanism for this, so people created their own mechanisms, however bizarre and problematic. Wife selling was a response to a real social need, the need for marriage dissolution, that the legal system refused to acknowledge or address. The practice also shows the gap between legal theory and social practice. Legally, wife selling was completely invalid, but socially it often functioned effectively. Communities recognized these transactions, treated the new couples as married, accepted the legitimacy of children born from these unions. Social norms and legal norms were operating on completely different tracks, and social norms often mattered more in people's daily lives than legal technicalities. And there's something almost darkly pragmatic about wife selling. It's easy to be horrified by it, and we should be horrified by it, but from the perspective of people living in that time with limited options, it solved problems. A woman in a miserable marriage got out. A man who wanted to be with her could be with her. A husband who wanted to be rid of his wife got rid of her. Everyone involved got what they wanted, or at least what they thought was the least bad option available to them. That doesn't excuse the practice or make it okay. Treating women as property is wrong regardless of whether it's pragmatically useful. But it helps explain why the practice persisted for so long despite having no legal basis. It filled a need that the legal system wasn't filling, and it did so in a way that most communities were willing to accept, at least until better alternatives became available. Now let's talk about the cultural legacy of wife selling, because even though the practice has been dead for over a century, it lingers in cultural memory. Thomas Hardy's novel, The Mayor of Casterbridge, introduced wife selling to generations of readers who might otherwise never have known about it. The opening scene, with the drunken protagonist selling his wife at a fair, has become iconic, regularly taught in literature classes, adapted for film and television. But Hardy's version, powerful as it is, doesn't fully capture the reality of historical wife selling. It's too dramatic, too impulsive, too focused on individual tragedy rather than systemic problems. The real history is less dramatically satisfying. It's not about one terrible moment of drunken bad judgment, but about ordinary people navigating impossible situations using the tools available to them, however inadequate and dehumanizing those tools were. Wife selling also shows up in folk songs and ballads from the period. There are traditional songs about wives being sold, usually with a humorous or cautionary tone. The wife selling and variations on that theme appear in collections of traditional English and American folk music. These songs treated the practice as something noteworthy but not shocking, part of the fabric of ordinary life rather than an aberration. In modern times, wife selling has become a historical curiosity, something people learn about with shock and disbelief. Wait, they actually did that? Like, really? It serves as an example of how different the past was, how much progress has been made in women's rights, how barbaric earlier societies treated women. It's deployed in arguments about historical oppression, about marriage history, about the evolution of women's status. But we should be careful about using historical wife selling as simple evidence of past barbarism while ignoring ongoing forms of women's subordination. Yes, we don't literally sell women in public markets anymore, at least not in Western societies. But women are still trafficked, still treated as property in various contexts, still denied autonomy over their bodies and lives in many parts of the world. The specific practice of wife selling is dead, but the underlying attitudes that enabled it, that women are less than fully human, that men have authority over women, that women's consent and agency don't really matter, those attitudes persist in various forms. Let's think about parallels to other historical practices involving women being treated as property. Bride prices, dowries, arranged marriages without the woman's consent, child marriages, women being married off to settle debts or forge political alliances. All of these involve treating women as transferable property rather than autonomous beings with their own desires and rights. Wife selling sits in this broader pattern, but with its own particular grotesqueness. The public nature of it, the explicit comparison to livestock sales, the physical rope around the neck, these details make it especially visceral and disturbing. Other forms of women being treated as property might be disguised with ritual or tradition or appeals to religion and custom. Wife selling was naked and explicit about what it was doing. There's also the question of how we should memorialize or teach about wife selling. Should it be presented as a historical curiosity, an odd footnote in the history of marriage? Should it be taught as an example of women's oppression and the importance of women's rights? Should it be contextualized within the broader problems of marriage law in the period? Probably all of the above, depending on the context and audience. What we shouldn't do is romanticize it or treat it as merely entertaining. Some historical accounts have leaned too heavily on the bizarre, colorful aspects of wife selling, the ropes, the auctions, the drinking, while minimizing the human cost. Real women were humiliated and traumatized by these transactions. Real lives were affected. The practice wasn't just a quirky historical oddity. It was a symptom of deep structural problems in how society treated women, individual stories, and what the practice reveals about marriage. Let's dive into some more specific documented cases to really understand what these women experienced and how varied the circumstances could be. In 1804, a case from Birmingham, England, involved a man named Joseph Thompson who sold his wife, Susanna, at the local market for 20 shillings. The newspaper report noted that Susanna seemed perfectly satisfied with the arrangement and that she and her purchaser, a local tradesman, had already been acquainted for some time. This suggests a prearranged situation where the sale was just the public formalization of a relationship that already existed. Susanna probably couldn't legally divorce Joseph, so the three of them worked out this arrangement where Joseph would be compensated for giving up his wife, Susanna would get to be with the man she preferred, and the new man would get the woman he wanted. Everyone walks away reasonably satisfied, except for the minor detail that Susanna had to be publicly auctioned like a piece of furniture. Then there's a case from 1807 in Plymouth, England, where a sailor sold his wife for 1 guinea. The woman's father was present at the sale and violently objected, trying to stop the transaction. But the husband insisted he had every right to sell his wife. The buyer had already paid, and the authorities present apparently didn't intervene. The woman was led away crying, with her father following and protesting. This case shows that not all sales were consensual arrangements, and that families of the women sometimes tried unsuccessfully to protect them. In 1820, there's a documented case from Yorkshire where a man named George Parker sold his wife at Pontefract Market. What makes this case notable is that Parker had previously been prosecuted for assaulting his wife, so this wasn't a case of a mutually agreed separation. This was a man getting rid of a wife he'd been violent toward, and finding someone willing to take her off his hands. The wife's opinion about any of this wasn't recorded. She was just a problem being disposed of. There's a particularly sad case from 1822 where an elderly woman was sold by her husband at a market. She was described in the newspaper report as being over 60 years old, having been married to her husband for over 40 years. He sold her for 1 shilling to a much younger man who apparently needed someone to keep house for him. The image of a woman in her 60s, after 40 years of marriage, being led through a market and sold to a stranger is just heartbreaking. What had gone wrong in that marriage after 4 decades together that led to this? In an 1832 case from Nottingham, a man sold his wife for 2 shillings and 6 pence, and the newspaper report noted that she appeared very cheerful on the occasion. But then the report continues with a darkly comic detail. The buyer tried to return her 2 days later, claiming she wasn't as advertised and he wanted his money back. The husband refused, saying all sales were final. So here you have a woman being treated literally like defective merchandise that someone tried to return for a refund. There's a case from 1837 that involved a genuine dispute over a wife sale. A man had sold his wife, but then the buyer refused to pay the agreed-upon price of £5. The seller took the buyer to court to try to force payment. The judge was baffled, pointing out that the entire transaction was illegal and the court couldn't possibly enforce an illegal contract. But the seller insisted he'd been cheated, that a deal was a deal. He genuinely seemed to believe he had legal standing to sue for payment for his sold wife. In America, there's a documented case from 1828 in Connecticut where a man attempted to sell his wife at a public venue but was arrested before the sale could be completed. This shows that American authorities were sometimes more willing to intervene than their English counterparts. The man was charged with attempting to dispose of his wife in an improper manner and fined. The wife was returned to her family, but the fact that the man thought he could do this publicly in 1828 Connecticut suggests the practice wasn't completely unknown even in relatively progressive American states. Another American case from 1839 in Kentucky involved a wife sale at a county fair. The woman was sold for $6 to a farmer who said he needed help running his household. The newspaper report mentioned that she had 3 children who remained with her original husband. Just imagine being that woman. Separated from your children, sold to a stranger, taken to live on a farm with a man you barely knew, all because your husband decided he was done with you. There's an 1852 case from England that involved a wife being sold multiple times. The woman was first sold by her original husband, then her purchaser sold her to someone else a few years later. and that man attempted to sell her again. She apparently protested the third sale, appealing to local authorities who finally intervened. By this point, she'd been passed around like property for years, each man treating her as something he could dispose of when she was no longer convenient. In 1858, a case from Hull, England involved a woman who was sold while visibly pregnant. The newspaper report mentions this detail almost casually, as if it were just another aspect of the transaction to note. The buyer presumably knew he was taking on not just a wife, but also the responsibility for a child that wasn't his. Or maybe he didn't care about the child. Either way, the woman's pregnancy didn't prevent her from being sold, didn't give her any additional protection or consideration. There's a case from 1862 where a wife sale ended in violence. The woman's brothers showed up at the sale and attacked both the husband and the buyer, trying to prevent the transaction. A brawl broke out in the market, and several people were arrested. The sale apparently didn't go through because of the disruption, but there's no record of what ultimately happened to the woman at the center of all this. Did she go back to her husband? Did she escape during the chaos? We don't know. An 1887 case from Devon is interesting because it happened so late. By the 1880s, divorce was legally available, the practice of wife selling was widely condemned, and Victorian propriety was at its height. And yet here's a man leading his wife through a market with a halter, selling her for half a crown to a local man. The newspaper report expresses shock that such a barbaric practice could still occur in the modern age. But occur it did, showing how slowly cultural practices change in isolated rural areas. Now let's think about what happened to these women after they were sold, because that's where the long-term consequences really become clear. For women whose sales were essentially consensual, where they wanted to leave their husbands and had chosen their buyers, the outcome might be reasonably positive. They'd escaped bad marriages and were living with men they preferred. Yes, they'd endured the humiliation of being publicly sold, but they'd achieved their goal of ending one relationship and starting another. But these women still faced challenges. They were living in relationships that had no legal recognition. If their new partner died, they couldn't inherit as a widow would. If he abandoned them, they had no legal recourse. They couldn't remarry because they were technically still married to their original husbands. Any children they had were legally illegitimate. They existed in a legal limbo that left them vulnerable. For women whose sales weren't consensual, whose husbands had sold them against their will, the outcomes were often worse. They might find themselves living with men who saw them as purchased property, as servants or laborers rather than partners. They might be treated badly, even abused, with no way to escape because where would they go? Back to the husband who sold them? To their families who might be ashamed of them? Into the streets as homeless women with no resources? Some sold women did eventually escape their situations. There are records of women who ran away from the men who'd bought them, who made their way to cities and tried to start new lives. Some women eventually reunited with their original husbands after the buyers tired of them. Some women managed to build tolerable lives in their new situations, making the best of circumstances they hadn't chosen. But across all these individual variations, the common thread is that women's agency and autonomy were completely disregarded. Whether the sale was technically consensual or not, whether the outcome was relatively positive or terrible, the fundamental problem was the same. Women were being treated as property that men could transfer at will. The specific circumstances of individual cases don't change that basic injustice. Let's talk about the children involved in these situations, because they're often forgotten in accounts of wife selling. When a woman was sold, what happened to her children? Sometimes the children stayed with the father, sometimes they went with the mother and her purchaser, sometimes they were split up with some staying and some going. There don't seem to have been any consistent rules or norms about this. Legally, children belonged to the father. He had custody rights regardless of what happened between him and his wife. So if a father wanted to keep the children when he sold his wife, he could. If he wanted to be rid of them too, he might let them go with their mother. The children's preferences didn't matter. The mother's preferences didn't matter. It was entirely up to the father's whim. Imagine being a child watching your mother being led through a market with a rope around her neck, being sold to a stranger. Imagine not knowing if you'll ever see her again. Imagine being torn between your mother and your father, or being taken away with your mother to live with a man you don't know. The psychological trauma for these children must have been significant. And for children who stayed with fathers after mothers were sold, there's the question of how they understood what had happened. Did fathers explain that they'd sold their mothers? Did they lie and say the mother had died or run away? Did the children eventually figure out the truth? How did this shape their understanding of marriage, of gender relations, of family bonds? The gender dynamics, social class, and broader implications. Let's think more deeply about the gender dynamics at play in wife selling, because beyond the obvious issue of women being treated as property, there are subtler aspects worth exploring. The practice reinforced male authority in multiple ways. It demonstrated that men controlled marriage, that men could end relationships unilaterally, that men's decisions about their wives were final and unchallenged. But it also revealed cracks in that patriarchal authority. The very existence of wife-selling showed that men's control over their wives wasn't absolute. A man who needed to sell his wife was admitting failure, failure to maintain his marriage, failure to keep his wife satisfied enough to stay, failure to fulfill the masculine ideal of being head of household. There's something almost pathetic about having to publicly auction off your wife because you couldn't make the marriage work. And the men who bought wives were in an interesting position too. They were acquiring women who had demonstrably failed in one marriage. They were taking on someone else's cast-off property, so to speak. This wasn't the prestigious marriage to a virgin bride that social norms idealized. This was getting a used wife secondhand with all the stigma that implied. Some buyers probably saw it as a practical solution to their own problems. If you were a widower or bachelor who needed someone to run your household, buying a wife at market was cheaper and simpler than formal courtship and marriage. You got a woman with proven domestic skills, and you didn't have to go through all the rituals of engagement and wedding ceremonies. Just pay your money and take her home. But other buyers were probably in love with the women they purchased. Remember, many sales involved women leaving their husbands for men they were already involved with. The sale was just the mechanism for formalizing that relationship. For these buyers, the transaction wasn't about acquiring property, but about being with someone they cared about. The public market sale was humiliating for both parties, but it was the price of being together. There's also the question of female agency within this system. Were women completely powerless victims? Or did some women manipulate the system to achieve their own goals? The answer is probably both, depending on the individual case. Some women were clearly victims with no say in their own sales. But other women may have actively pushed for sales, may have arranged for buyers, may have used the system to escape bad marriages. This doesn't excuse the system or make it less problematic. Women having to resort to being publicly auctioned in order to leave bad marriages shows how limited their options were. The agency of choosing to be sold is pretty grim agency, but it does complicate the simple narrative of women as purely passive victims. Some women found ways to make choices within an oppressive system, even if those choices were all bad. Now let's think about class dynamics more carefully. We've mentioned that wife selling was primarily a working class practice, but what does that actually mean in terms of who these people were and how they lived? We're talking about agricultural laborers, domestic servants, craftsmen, small farmers, people who worked with their hands and lived on the edge of poverty. For these people, marriage was an economic partnership as much as an emotional relationship. Husbands and wives worked together to survive, farming, running small businesses, raising children who would eventually contribute to the household economy. If that partnership broke down, if the husband and wife couldn't work together anymore, the household economy collapsed. Wife selling was one way of addressing this problem. It dissolved one economic partnership and created new ones. The husband was freed to potentially remarry or manage on his own. The wife entered a new household where presumably she'd be more productive. The buyer gained a household manager and worker. The emotional and personal aspects of marriage were secondary to these economic considerations. This is very different from how elite marriages functioned. For wealthy people, marriage was about property transmission, political alliances, maintaining family status. You married to combine estates, to forge connections between powerful families, to produce legitimate heirs who would inherit. The economic aspect was about capital and property, not about two people working side by side to grow food and stay alive. Elite marriages could survive indefinitely even if the spouses hated each other, because they didn't need to actually live together or cooperate on a daily basis. They had separate households, separate social lives, separate finances. As long as they maintained appearances and produced an heir, the marriage fulfilled its purpose. But working-class marriages required daily cooperation. If a laborer and his wife couldn't work together, couldn't manage their household together, the marriage failed in its fundamental purpose. This practical failure might be what drove wife-selling, not primarily about emotional dissatisfaction or sexual problems, but about the basic inability to function as an economic unit. Of course, emotional and sexual problems were also factors. Accounts of wife-selling mention wives being quarrelsome or unfaithful or shrewish. They mention husbands being drunk or violent or lazy. These aren't purely economic descriptions, but they're problems that affected the household's economic functioning as much as its emotional atmosphere. Let's talk about alcohol's role in wife-selling, because it comes up repeatedly in the historical record. Many accounts mention that sales took place in taverns or that the husband was drunk when he decided to sell his wife. Thomas Hardy's fictional wife sale prominently features the husband being intoxicated. There's clearly an association between alcohol and wife selling. This might be partially explained by the fact that markets and fairs, where many sales took place, were also sites of heavy drinking. Social gatherings in this period often involved alcohol. Men conducting business deals would drink together. So a wife sale happening in the context of drinking wasn't unusual. Lots of business happened while people were drinking. But the emphasis on drunkenness in accounts of wife selling might also serve an explanatory function. If a man sold his wife while drunk, that made the action less calculated, less coldly rational, less completely his fault. He was impaired, not himself, not responsible for his actions. This narrative protected the man's reputation somewhat. He wasn't a monster who sold his wife. He was a fool who got drunk and did something regrettable. For women, having been sold by a drunk husband might also be slightly less shameful than being sold by a sober one. At least you could tell yourself and others that he wasn't in his right mind, that he didn't really mean it, that this was an accident rather than a deliberate rejection. These are thin consolations, but people grasp at whatever thin consolations are available. In reality, while alcohol certainly lowered inhibitions and might have prompted some impulsive sales, most wife sales were probably more calculated than the drunkenness narrative suggests. Finding a buyer required negotiation. Arranging the time and place required planning. Even the ritual aspects, the halter, the bill of sale, the public announcement, these all suggest premeditation rather than drunken impulse. Let's think about the witnesses to these sales, the crowds who gathered to watch. What were they thinking as they watched a woman be sold like livestock? Some were probably entertained. This was free drama, something to break up the monotony of daily life. Some were probably sympathetic to the woman but felt powerless to intervene. Some probably thought the whole thing was perfectly normal and acceptable. The witnesses served multiple functions. They legitimized the sale by their presence. They could later testify that the transaction had occurred, which gave it a quasi-legal status. They enforced the social recognition of the sale. If everyone saw the wife sold and accepted it, the new arrangement would be socially recognized even though it had no legal standing. But witnesses could also disrupt sales if they chose to. A hostile crowd could shame the participants, could refuse to bid, could appeal to authorities to intervene. The fact that most sales proceeded without disruption suggests that most communities either approved of the practice or at least tolerated it. This collective complicity is as disturbing as the practice itself. Now let's consider what wife selling tells us about love and marriage in this period. The modern conception of marriage is primarily about love and emotional fulfillment. We marry people we're in love with, and if love dies, we feel the marriage has failed and we should end it. But this understanding of marriage is relatively recent. For most of history, including the period when wife selling occurred, marriage was primarily about economic survival, producing legitimate children, maintaining social order, and transferring property. Love might develop between spouses, and that was nice, but it wasn't the point of marriage. Marriages were arranged by families for strategic reasons, or people married whoever was available and suitable in their community. Wife selling existed in this context where marriage wasn't primarily about love. If a marriage wasn't working economically or socially, if the partners couldn't cooperate or were making each other miserable, there needed to be some way to end it. Since legal divorce was unavailable, informal mechanisms like wife selling filled the gap. But here's what's interesting. Many accounts of wife selling involve women being sold to men they were already emotionally involved with. This suggests that romantic love was a factor even in working-class marriages in this period. Women had feelings for specific men. They wanted to be with those men rather than with their husbands. They were willing to endure the humiliation of being publicly sold in order to be with someone they loved. So wife selling reveals a tension between different understandings of marriage. The practice itself treated marriage as an economic arrangement that could be dissolved through commercial transaction. But the circumstances of many sales, wives choosing buyers they loved, couples using the sale as a way to be together, showed that emotional bonds mattered too. People wanted both economic stability and emotional fulfillment from marriage, and they struggled to reconcile these goals within a legal system that offered no legitimate way to end marriages that failed on either dimension. Comparative practices, legal attempts to stop it, and final reflections. Let's put wife selling in a broader comparative context by looking at similar practices in other cultures and times. The specific ritual of public auction was distinctively English and Anglo-American, but the underlying issue, what to do when marriages fail in societies where divorce is impossible or extremely difficult, is universal, and different societies develop different solutions. In some cultures, marriages could be dissolved relatively easily. Among certain Native American tribes, for example, either spouse could end a marriage simply by moving out and living separately. There was no elaborate legal process, no religious prohibition, just a pragmatic acceptance that some marriages don't work and forcing people to stay together doesn't benefit anyone. The ease of marriage dissolution in these societies stood in stark contrast to the rigidity of Christian European marriage law. In other societies, practices like bride price or dowry meant that marriage dissolution involved economic negotiations about returning payments. If a husband wanted to divorce his wife in a society with bride price, he might forfeit what he'd paid for her. If a woman's family wanted to end the marriage, they might have to return the bride price. These economic aspects made ending marriages complicated but not impossible. Wife selling resembles bride price systems in some ways. The husband receives payment when the wife leaves, which compensates him for his economic loss. But bride price typically happened at the beginning of marriage, paid by the groom to the bride's family, while wife selling happened during or at the end of marriage, paid by a new partner to the husband. Still, both practices treated women as having economic value that needed to be compensated when transferred between men. In some societies, particularly in Asia, there were practices of selling daughters into marriage or servitude that somewhat resemble wife selling but with the family rather than the husband doing the selling. In times of famine or economic crisis, poor families might sell daughters to wealthier families, either as servants or as wives for sons. This was more about survival than about dissolving failed marriages, but it shared the disturbing element of women being treated as tradable commodities. What makes English and American wife selling distinctive is the public ritual aspect. The market setting, the crowd of witnesses, the auction format, the rope or halter. These theatrical elements seem specific to this particular cultural practice. Other societies might have treated women as property in various ways, but they didn't typically conduct literal public auctions of wives in marketplaces. Now let's talk about legal responses to wife selling, because authorities did occasionally try to stop the practice even though they struggled to figure out how. The fundamental problem was that wife selling wasn't technically illegal. There was no law against it, but it was clearly improper and contrary to the legal understanding of marriage. Some men who sold their wives were prosecuted for leading a woman through the streets in an improper manner, or creating a public disturbance, or behavior likely to cause a breach of the peace. These charges skirted around the actual issue because there was no crime of selling your wife on the books. The spectacle and public nature of wife selling could be prosecuted even if the sale itself couldn't. In 1801, an English court tried to establish legal precedent by ruling definitively that wife selling had no legal validity whatsoever. The judge declared that the practice was a gross outrage upon public decency and morals, and that anyone attempting it could be prosecuted. But this ruling had limited effect because it didn't change the underlying problem. People still couldn't get legal divorces, so they still needed some mechanism for ending failed marriages. Some localities tried to prevent wife selling by having authorities break up sales when they occurred. Market officials or constables would intervene when they saw a woman being led to sale, would disperse the crowd, would threaten the husband with prosecution. But this required someone with authority being present and willing to intervene, which wasn't always the case. And even when sales were broken up, this didn't solve the underlying marital problem. The couple was still trapped in a failed marriage with no legal way out. Breaking up the sale just forced them to continue in misery or to find some other, possibly more problematic, way of dealing with their situation. Churches also condemned wife-selling as a mockery of the marriage sacrament. Ministers preached against it, refused to baptize children born to sold wives and their purchasers, and socially shunned people who participated in these transactions. But religious condemnation only worked on people who cared about their standing in the church, and many working-class people had a pretty loose relationship with organized religion by this point. The most effective way to end wife-selling was to make legal divorce accessible, which finally happened with the expansion of divorce laws in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Once people had a legitimate way to end marriages, the need for quasi-legal rituals like wife-selling disappeared. The practice died out not because authorities successfully suppressed it, but because it became unnecessary. This tells us something important about the relationship between law and social practice. You can't eliminate a practice just by declaring it illegal or immoral if that practice serves a real social function and no legal alternative exists. People will find ways to do what they need to do regardless of what authorities say. Only when legal marriage dissolution became possible did wife-selling truly end. Now, as we approach the end of this long exploration, let's think about what lessons we can draw from the history of wife-selling. First, the practice reveals how legal systems can fail to address real human needs, creating gaps that people fill with their own informal mechanisms. The law said marriage was indissoluble, but people's lived experience was that many marriages failed and needed to be ended. Wife-selling was a response to this gap between legal theory and lived reality. Second, wife-selling shows how women's subordinate status was enforced through both legal and social mechanisms. Women weren't just legally disadvantaged, though they certainly were. They were also socially understood as property, as objects to be transferred between men, as having value primarily in their domestic and reproductive labor. This understanding was so deeply embedded that communities would gather to watch women be sold like livestock without finding anything fundamentally wrong with the practice. Third, the practice demonstrates that historical change happens slowly and unevenly. Even after divorce became legally available, even after Victorian morality condemned wife-selling as barbaric, even after women's rights movements began challenging women's subordinate status, the practice continued in isolated pockets. Cultural attitudes and practices can persist for generations after the material conditions that created them have changed. Fourth, wife-selling reminds us that people in the past were trying to solve real problems with the tools available to them, even when those tools were deeply flawed. It's easy to look back and judge, to be horrified by how women were treated, to wonder how anyone could think this was acceptable. But people living in that time weren't monsters. They were human beings navigating difficult situations within systems they didn't create and couldn't easily change. That doesn't excuse the practice. Women being treated as property is wrong regardless of the historical context or the practical problems it purported to solve. But understanding the context helps us see how these practices emerged and persisted, which is important for preventing similar abuses in the future. Fifth, the history of wife-selling shows the importance of legal reforms that give people legitimate ways to address their needs and problems. When divorce became accessible, wife-selling disappeared. This pattern appears throughout history. When people have legal, dignified ways to solve problems, they stop resorting to extra-legal, undignified alternatives. The lesson for contemporary policymakers is that failing to provide legal mechanisms for addressing real needs doesn't make those needs go away. It just pushes people toward problematic alternatives. Let's think about how we should remember and teach about wife-selling. It's tempting to treat it as a bizarre historical curiosity, something to be shocked and amused by. And there is something almost darkly absurd about men leading their wives through markets with ropes around their necks, conducting mock legal auctions, pretending this was a legitimate way to end marriages. But we shouldn't let the absurdity distract from the human cost. Real women were humiliated and traumatized. Real lives were damaged. Real children were affected by watching their mothers be sold or being separated from their parents. The practice was a symptom of deep structural injustices in how society treated women and in how law approached marriage. So when we tell this story, we need to balance the bizarre details that make it memorable with serious analysis of what it meant and why it mattered. We need to center women's experiences and perspectives, even though most of the historical record was created by men. We need to connect it to broader patterns of women's oppression and to the long struggle for women's rights and dignity. We should also resist the temptation to see this as purely a story of past barbarism that we've completely left behind. Yes, we don't literally sell women in public markets anymore in Western societies. That's progress. But women are still trafficked internationally, still sold in various contexts, still treated as property in many parts of the world. The specific practice has ended, but the underlying problem, women being denied full humanity and autonomy, persists globally. And even in societies where women have legal equality, there are echoes of wife-selling in how women are discussed and treated. Women's value being tied to their appearance and reproductive capacity. Women being treated as accessories to men's lives rather than as complete people in their own right. Women's choices being constrained and controlled in various ways. The attitudes that enabled wife-selling didn't completely disappear just because the specific practice ended. The emotional landscape and the long shadow of the practice. As we drift toward the conclusion of this long, strange journey through the history of wife-selling, let's spend some time thinking about the emotional and psychological dimensions that often get lost in the historical documentation. We have newspaper reports, court records, diary entries, but these rarely capture the full emotional reality of what it meant to be sold, to sell someone, or to witness these transactions. Imagine being a woman waking up on the morning you know your husband plans to sell you. Maybe you've agreed to this. Maybe you're relieved to be leaving him and going to someone you've chosen. But you still have to go through with the public ritual. You still have to walk through streets where your neighbors will see you. You still have to stand in a market while your husband lists your qualities and faults like you're a horse. You still have to have a rope put around your neck, still have to be led like an animal, still have to hear men bid on you. Even if you want the outcome, the process is designed to be humiliating. That's partly the point, the public nature of it, the theater, the explicit comparison to livestock. It's meant to demonstrate male authority, to show that women are property, to reinforce social hierarchies. You're not just leaving one man for another. You're being publicly marked as an object, as property, as less than fully human. And what if you don't want this? What if your husband has decided to sell you against your will, and you have no power to stop it? The terror and helplessness must have been overwhelming. You're being disposed of like unwanted furniture, handed over to a stranger or near stranger who now has authority over your life. You have no legal recourse, no way to appeal, no protection. You just have to endure it and hope your new situation won't be worse than what you're leaving. For the husbands, the emotional landscape was probably varied. Some men likely felt relief at being free of wives they disliked or couldn't get along with. The sale allowed them to end the marriage, get some compensation, and move on with their lives. Maybe they'd remarry informally, maybe they'd stay single. Either way, they were free. But other husbands probably felt shame and failure. A man was supposed to be head of his household, master of his domain. Having to publicly sell your wife advertised that you'd failed at marriage, failed to keep your wife satisfied enough to stay, failed to maintain your household. Even if you wanted to be rid of her, the public nature of the sale marked you as someone whose marriage hadn't worked. In a society that valued male authority and family stability, this was embarrassing. And some husbands probably felt genuine grief. Not all wife sales were about men wanting to be rid of wives they hated. Some were about couples who had grown apart, where both people might have preferred different outcomes but saw no other option. A man selling a wife he'd once loved, even if that love had died, might feel real sadness about the failure of the marriage. For the buyers, the emotional situation was complex too. Some were probably just practical men who needed wives for household labor and saw the market sale as an efficient way to acquire one. No different than hiring a servant, except you got someone permanently rather than having to pay wages. These men probably didn't think much about the emotional dimensions at all. But others were buying women they loved, women they'd been involved with, women they wanted to build lives with. For them, the wife sale was deeply uncomfortable. You don't want to buy the woman you love like she's livestock, but it's the only way to be together, so you go through with it. You pay the price, you lead her away, you try to build something better than what she's leaving. And then there were buyers who might have been attracted to the power dynamic, who specifically wanted women who'd been marked as property, who'd been publicly humiliated. There's always been a subset of men who are attracted to women in vulnerable positions, who see that vulnerability as something to exploit. Some wife buyers were probably in this category, which makes the practice even darker. For the children of these marriages, the emotional impact extended across years and generations. Growing up knowing your mother was sold, or that your father sold your mother, shaped how you understood family, marriage, gender, power. Did you learn that this was normal? Did you internalize that women were property? Did you perpetuate these attitudes in your own relationships? Or did you see the pain it caused and reject it? Did you fight for different relationships, different ways of being? Some children of sold mothers probably became advocates for women's rights, driven by witnessing their mother's humiliation. Others probably accepted it as the natural order and replicated the same patterns in their own lives. The witnesses to these sales, the crowds who gathered to watch, were participating in a collective act that reinforced social norms. By watching, by not intervening, by sometimes bidding or encouraging others to bid, they were saying, "This is acceptable, this is normal, this is how we handle marital problems in our community." Their presence legitimized the practice. But some witnesses must have been uncomfortable. Some must have felt sympathy for the women being sold. Some must have questioned whether this was right. Yet they stayed silent because speaking up would mark them as troublemakers, as people who didn't respect community norms, as outsiders. The social pressure to conform, to accept what everyone else accepted, was powerful. Now let's think about how the practice of wife-selling connects to other forms of sanctioned cruelty toward women throughout history. The witch trials, where women were publicly accused, tried, and executed on flimsy evidence. The ducking stools, where women accused of being scolds were strapped to chairs and dunked in water as public punishment. The scold's bridle, or branks, metal masks locked onto women's heads to prevent them from speaking. All of these practices shared common elements. They were public, they were humiliating, they reduced women to objects or animals, and they were socially acceptable within the communities that practiced them. They were tools for controlling women, for punishing women who didn't conform to proper feminine behavior, for demonstrating male authority. Wife-selling fits this pattern. It was another mechanism for controlling women and reinforcing their subordinate status. The specific form it took, the market sale, the rope, the auction, was culturally specific, but the underlying function was the same as these other practices. Keep women in their place. Remind them they're property. Demonstrate that their autonomy and dignity are conditional and can be taken away at any time. Understanding this helps us see wife-selling not as an isolated bizarre practice, but as part of a broader system of women's subordination. And it helps us understand why these practices persisted for so long. They weren't accidents or aberrations, they were functioning parts of patriarchal social systems. They served purposes, however terrible those purposes were. Let's also think about resistance. We've talked about women who resisted being sold, who ran away or protested or appealed to authorities. But there were probably other, quieter forms of resistance too. Women who made the best of their situations but never stopped resenting what had been done to them. Women who told their daughters, "Never let a man do this to you." Women who supported each other in dealing with the aftermath of sales. There might have been communities where women collectively refused to recognize wife sales, where they supported women in leaving their purchasers, where they created networks of mutual aid that gave women alternatives to accepting their sold status. These forms of resistance are harder to document because they happened in private spaces, in women's conversations that weren't recorded, in actions that didn't make it into official records. But resistance existed, even if we can't always trace it in the historical record. We know this because the practice eventually ended, because social attitudes changed, because women's status improved. That didn't happen just because laws changed or men suddenly became enlightened. It happened partly because women resisted individually and collectively, in ways large and small, creating pressure for change that eventually became undeniable. Now, as we really do approach the end of this exploration, let's talk about what we owe to the women whose stories we've discussed tonight. They're long dead, These women who were sold in markets and fairs across England and America. Their immediate suffering is over, but their memory persists, and we have responsibilities in how we remember them. We owe them honesty. We need to tell their stories accurately, not romanticizing or minimizing what they experienced. We owe them context, explaining the legal and social systems that trapped them, not treating their situations as just individual bad luck. We owe them connection to broader patterns, showing how their experiences related to women's subordination more broadly, not treating each story as isolated. We owe them respect for their complexity. They weren't just passive victims, even when they were victimized. They made choices within constrained circumstances. They survived, they adapted, they sometimes found ways to assert agency even within oppressive systems. We can acknowledge their strength without excusing the systems that required that strength. And we owe them relevance. We need to connect their stories to ongoing struggles for women's rights and dignity. We need to use their experiences to illuminate contemporary issues. We need to honor them by working to ensure that women today and in the future never face the kind of treatment they endured. The women who were sold in markets weren't saints or heroes or representatives of idealized womanhood. They were ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. They were flawed humans dealing with impossible situations as best they could. Some of them were admirable, some less so. Most were probably complicated mixtures of strength and weakness, courage and fear, dignity and desperation. They deserve to be remembered as fully human, not reduced to symbols or statistics, not simplified into victims or villains, but understood as complete people living through historical circumstances that were often cruel and unjust. Their stories are part of the larger story of women's struggle for equality and autonomy, a struggle that continues today in different forms. Final reflections and the long arc of change. As we reach the final stretch of this long night's journey through the strange and troubling world of wife selling, let's pull back and think about the bigger picture one last time. What does this practice, now dead for over a century, tell us about the long arc of social change and the ongoing project of human dignity and equality? First, it tells us that progress is possible but not inevitable. Wife selling existed for centuries despite being clearly dehumanizing and unjust. It persisted not because no one could imagine better alternatives, but because the systems that enabled it, restrictive marriage laws, women's legal subordination, economic desperation, were deeply entrenched. Change required challenging those systems, which meant challenging powerful interests and long-held beliefs. The end of wife selling came through multiple converging forces. Legal reforms that made divorce accessible, economic changes that gave women more options, social movements that challenged women's subordinate status, cultural shifts that made the practice seem increasingly barbaric rather than acceptable. No single factor was sufficient. It took a comprehensive transformation of the legal, economic, and cultural landscape. This is a pattern we see repeatedly in the history of social reform. Entrenched injustices don't disappear just because they're unjust or because some people recognize them as such. They disappear when the systems supporting them are dismantled, when alternatives become available, when cultural attitudes shift enough that the practices become unsustainable. This took generations in the case of wife selling, and it took active work by people who pushed for change. Second, the history of wife selling reminds us that what seems normal and acceptable in one era can seem horrifying in another. The newspaper reports that treated wife sales as amusing curiosities, the crowds who gathered to watch without protest, the communities that recognized and enforced these transactions. All of these people saw nothing fundamentally wrong with what was happening. Their moral frameworks made wife selling comprehensible and even acceptable. This should make us humble about our own moral certainties. What practices that seem normal and acceptable to us now will future generations look back on with horror? What are we collectively participating in or enabling that we don't recognize as problematic because we're embedded in systems that normalize it? We can't see outside our own cultural moment any better than the people who watched wife sales could see outside theirs. But this cuts both ways. Yes, we should be humble about our own blind spots, but we should also be confident in moral progress. The fact that we now recognize wife selling as a gross violation of human dignity, that we've built legal and social systems that make such practices unnecessary and unthinkable, this is real progress. We're not just different from our ancestors, were better in some important ways. Recognizing the contingency of moral frameworks doesn't mean all moral frameworks are equally valid. Third, wife selling illustrates how law and social practice can diverge, creating situations where what's legal and what's functional are completely different. Legally, wife selling was invalid, but socially it often functioned effectively. Communities recognized these transactions, new couples were treated as married, children from these unions were accepted. The law said one thing, but life happened differently. This tells us something important about the limits of law. You can declare something illegal or invalid, but if people need to do it and have no legal alternatives, they'll do it anyway and create informal systems to make it work. Effective legal reform requires not just prohibiting bad practices, but providing good alternatives. The campaign against wife selling succeeded not primarily through criminalization, but through divorce law reform that gave people legitimate ways to end failed marriages. Contemporary policy debates could learn from this. When people are doing something harmful or problematic, asking why are they doing this, what need does it fulfill, what legal alternative could we provide, is often more effective than simply trying to prohibit the behavior. Wife selling existed because people needed ways to end marriages and had no legal options. It ended when legal options became available. The lesson is clear. Fourth, the practice shows us how women's subordinate status was maintained through both formal legal mechanisms and informal social practices. Women couldn't own property, couldn't vote, couldn't sue, couldn't make contracts. These formal legal disabilities were reinforced by informal practices like wife selling that demonstrated women's status as property in visceral public ways. Changing women's status required attacking both the formal and informal dimensions. Legal reforms gave women rights on paper, but cultural changes were necessary to make those rights meaningful in practice. The women's rights movement had to work on multiple fronts simultaneously: legal reform, economic opportunity, educational access, and cultural transformation of attitudes about women's capabilities and worth. We're still living through this process. Women have formal legal equality in many countries now, but informal practices, cultural attitudes, and structural barriers continue to limit women's full participation and dignity. Understanding how formal and informal mechanisms of subordination work together historically helps us see how they continue to work together today. Fifth, wife selling reminds us of the importance of documentation and historical memory. We know about this practice because people wrote about it in newspapers, in diaries, in court records, in novels. These documents preserved knowledge of something that participants might have preferred to forget. The historical record, incomplete and biased as it is, allows us to know our past, to learn from it, to avoid repeating its worst mistakes. This is why historical scholarship matters. This is why archives matter. This is why we need to preserve documents, tell difficult stories, and grapple with uncomfortable truths about the past. Not to wallow in historical grievances or to shame contemporary people for their ancestors' actions, but to understand how we got here, what patterns persist, and what possibilities exist for different futures. Now, let's think one final time about the individual human beings at the center of these stories. The women who stood in markets with ropes around their necks, the husbands who sold them, the buyers who purchased them, the children who watched, the witnesses who gathered. They were all people navigating their lives as best they could within systems they mostly didn't choose and couldn't easily change. Some of them made choices we'd consider moral, people trying to escape bad situations, people trying to be with those they loved, people trying to survive. Some made choices we'd consider immoral, people treating other humans as property, people exploiting vulnerable others, people participating in dehumanizing practices. Most probably made complex mixtures of both kinds of choices because that's what humans do. We can judge their actions without judging them as people. We can say wife selling was wrong, deeply, seriously wrong, while recognizing that individuals who participated in it were operating within constraints we can barely imagine. We can acknowledge their humanity while condemning the systems that shaped their choices. And we can honor them, all of them, by learning from their experiences, by using their stories to illuminate ongoing struggles, by connecting past injustices to present ones, by drawing on their pain to motivate continued work toward a world where no one is treated as property, where everyone's dignity and autonomy are respected, where legal systems provide just solutions rather than forcing people toward unjust alternatives. The last documented wife sale in England was in 1913. The last generation who might have had direct memories of the practice has been gone for decades now. The women who were sold, the men who sold and bought them, the children who witnessed it, all gone. But the lessons remain. The patterns remain. The need for vigilance against dehumanization remains. As you drift off to sleep tonight, wrapped in the comfort of a world where women aren't literally sold in public markets, where marriages can be legally dissolved, where women have rights and protections that would have seemed impossible to those long ago market crowds, maybe spare a thought for how far we've come. And maybe also a thought for how far we still need to go. Because the fundamental issues that wife selling exemplified, power imbalances in relationships, economic desperation forcing terrible choices, law failing to address human needs, women's autonomy being constrained, communities accepting practices that dehumanize vulnerable members, these issues persist in various forms. The specific practice is dead, but the underlying patterns require ongoing attention and resistance. The women who were sold wanted what all humans want: autonomy, dignity, the ability to make choices about their own lives, to live with respect and security. Most of them didn't get those things, at least not fully. They made do with what they could get, survived as best they could, passed their stories down when they could. We owe them the truth of their experiences. We owe them the connections to broader patterns of injustice. We owe them the continued work of building societies where no one has to endure what they endured. We owe them memory that honors their complexity and their humanity while clearly condemning the systems that oppress them. And with that, we've reached the end of this long, strange, troubling journey through the history of wife selling in early America and England. The sun is coming up somewhere, but hopefully you're sound asleep by now, your mind gently processing these stories of desperation and survival, of injustice and resistance, of a practice that once seemed normal and now seems unthinkable. Sleep well, and remember, history is full of practices that once seemed acceptable and now horrify us. This should make us both grateful for progress and vigilant about present injustices we might not fully recognize. The women who were sold in markets would want us to learn from their experiences, to do better, to build a world where human dignity is universal rather than contingent. The practice is dead. The memory remains. The lessons endure. And somewhere in that endurance is hope. Hope that we can continue learning, continue growing, continue building societies where everyone is recognized as fully human, where no one is property, where dignity and autonomy are rights rather than privileges. Good night, and may your dreams be free from the marketplace of human souls.